Beer, the liquid that built civilization. What if I told you that our entire civilization, everything we've built, everything we've achieved from the Egyptian pyramids to space stations, stands on beer? Sounds like the ramblings of a drunk historian? Perhaps. But the facts tell a different story. We're used to thinking of beer as a simple drink for unwinding after a long day. Something you crack open on Friday night in front of the TV. Something rarely mentioned in serious conversations. But this is a fundamental misconception that conceals one of humanity's most captivating stories. Every year, people on this planet consume about 200 billion litres of beer. 200 billion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 200 Olympic swimming pools worth. Every single day. It's the world's most consumed alcoholic beverage. But its true significance isn't measured in volume. It's measured in its influence on the very essence of who we are as a species. There's a provocative hypothesis, increasingly discussed in scientific circles, that fundamentally changes our understanding of how civilization began. Some researchers believe that the irresistible urge to brew beer, not the need for bread, was the catalyst that drove our ancestors to abandon their nomadic lifestyle, settle down, and begin cultivating fields. Consider the profound implications of this idea. Perhaps it wasn't hunger that bound us to the plough. Sometimes the engine of civilization isn't necessity, but celebration. The thirst for a foaming, intoxicating drink may have sparked the greatest turning point in human history, the Neolithic Revolution that forever separated humanity from the wild. Before you lies a story not about alcohol in its conventional sense. This is a tale of how accidentally fermented grain porridge became an engine of social development, universal currency, sacred gift of the gods, and a remedy considered medicine for nearly every ailment for centuries. We'll see how this drink became grounds for revolutions and even a tool in geopolitical struggles. This is a story about women brewers whose role in history was deliberately erased or slandered, about times when witch hunts turned craft independence into grounds for execution. This is a narrative about monks and saints who became patrons of brewing, about harsh laws that dictated the rules for centuries, and about bloody riots these laws provoked. Today, we'll trace the entire journey of this remarkable drink. From stone mortars in Levantine caves to laboratory modules on the International Space Station, where scientists study yeast behaviour and fermentation in microgravity. From ancient Sumerian goddesses to craft breweries in hipster neighbourhoods across the globe. Before you, the history of beer, which means this is our story, seen through the prism of one of humanity's oldest inventions. The Neolithic Revolution. Let's rewind time, way back. To an era when there was no writing, no wheel, no states, no cities. A time when humans were just beginning to see themselves as something more than another primate species wandering the savannas in search of food. Rakafet Cave, northern Israel, on the slopes of Mount Carmel, approximately 12 to 10,000 years before our era. Here, in the cool twilight of limestone vaults, people of the Natufian culture laid their dead to rest. Archaeologists working at this site discovered something astonishing. In the burial area, they found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock, and in the microscopic pores of this ancient stone, chemical traces remained of a fermented drink based on wheat and barley. This wasn't yet beer as we know it. It resembled thick, cloudy porridge with a mild alcoholic effect, something between soup and liquid oatmeal, but this was exactly that. One of the oldest chemically confirmed evidence of grain brewing on the planet, and it appeared in an era when hunter-gatherers already knew how to make primitive flatbreads from wild grains, but didn't yet know permanent settlements and agriculture in the full sense. This drink was part of a sacred ritual, a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. The Natufians believed the dead needed sustenance for their journey to the afterlife, and left them the most valuable things they possessed. And the most valuable turned out to be not just food, but a consciousness-altering substance that brought joy and oblivion. But if you think this was just a modest home preparation for family rites, prepare for the story's scale to change dramatically. We move several hundred kilometres north to southeastern modern Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, a place that baffles even the most sceptical scientists. When German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt realised in 1994 the scale of what lay buried underground, he could barely believe his eyes. Before him opened a monumental temple complex, enormous stone circles of T-shaped pillars covered with masterful carvings depicting predators, snakes, and scorpions. Some central columns weigh 8 to 10 tons each, and all this was constructed between 9,500 and 8,000 years before our era, built by people at the junction between the hunting world and early Neolithic, who, according to all old textbooks, simply weren't capable of such achievements. How did groups of nomads scattered across a vast territory coordinate their efforts to build these giant structures? Where did the motivation come from to drag multi-ton blocks without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools? The central question, why? The answer, it appears, lies once again in beer. Archaeologists found thousands of grinding tools and giant limestone vats, with capacities up to 160 litres at Göbekli Tepe. That's the equivalent of more than 300 modern bottles. Analysis of these vat surfaces showed residues characteristic of grain processing and fermentation. Lead excavation archaeologist Oliver Dietrich proposed a hypothesis that large-scale feasts with enormous amounts of beer weren't mere entertainment, but the most important social mechanism. This was the cement that held early society together, a way to gather, feed, water, and unite hundreds, even thousands of people from different tribes for common titanic labour. Back in the mid-20th century, American archaeologist Robert Braidwood asked a provocative question that was then considered heresy. Could the discovery of fermented porridge's intoxicating effect have been a more powerful stimulus for domesticating grains than the invention of bread? The scientific community dismissed it then, but decades later anthropologist Solomon Katz returned to this idea and supported it with compelling arguments. His logic was elegant and persuasive. First, fermentation allowed storing grain surpluses in a different form, critically important in humid climates where harvests quickly rotted or were consumed by pests. Second, the fermentation process and accompanying heating reduced microbial risks. In a world where every sip of stream water could be lethal, weak alcoholic beer was considerably safer. And third, most importantly, the psychological effect. Alcohol broke down barriers between strangers, transforming groups of wary, armed people into something unified. It provided energy for exhausting labour and created a sense of celebration in a world where life was short, brutal, and full of suffering. Beer became a window to another brighter reality for our ancestors. So what came first, bread or beer? This question ceases to be merely a historical curiosity. It touches on a fundamental mystery. What exactly made us abandon nomadic freedom and chain ourselves to the land, to fields and endlessly demanding agricultural labour? Was it only hunger that forced this choice? Or was it thirst? Thirst for something more than mere physical survival? Mesopotamia, cradle of civilization and brewing. From the mists of prehistoric times, we move to the fertile lands between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. 4th millennium before our era, Mesopotamia. Here, in hot, dusty valleys irrigated by complex canal systems, the Sumerians created one of the world's first true civilizations. Giant cities like Uruk with tens of thousands of inhabitants, one of the first writing systems, cuneiform on clay tablets, the first schools, the first astronomical observations, and of course, the first true, documented beer culture. For the Sumerians, beer wasn't just a beverage to wash down dinner. It was the foundation of life itself, the economic backbone of society, a sacred gift from the gods. They even had their own patron goddess of brewing, Ninkasi. Her name is often translated as she who fills the mouth. It appears in texts so frequently that archaeologists joke The Sumerians prayed to her almost more often than to the sky god Anu himself. And the Sumerians left us something truly priceless, the hymn to Ninkasi, preserved in an old Babylonian record from approximately 1800 BCE, though likely dating back to an earlier tradition. This work is simultaneously a religious text, poetic praise of the goddess, and a step-by-step description of the brewing process so detailed that people have actually tried to reconstruct ancient beer from it. One of the earliest known written descriptions of brewing in human history. The hymn describes the entire process from beginning to end. First, they prepared bapir, special beer bread baked to a dark colour. They crumbled it, mixed it with sprouted barley, malt, and added sweet components like dates or honey for flavour and aroma. All this was flooded with water and set to ferment in huge ceramic vats. The process could take days or weeks depending on the desired result. The Sumerians had many beer varieties, each with its own name: white beer, red, black, sweet, bitter, strong, weak. Archaeologists have counted mentions of at least 8 different types, and they consumed it in a very specific way that would seem strange to us today. In the tomb of Queen Puabi in the ancient city of Ur, dated approximately 2600 BCE, archaeologists discovered remarkable artifacts. Among gold jewellery, lapis lazuli beads, and other treasures lay long drinking tubes, luxurious, crafted from metal and decorated elaborately. At first, scientists couldn't understand their purpose. Then it became clear these were straws for drinking. One of the oldest drinking straw traditions is associated with Mesopotamia. The Sumerians definitely practiced this. Though the title of world's first remains debatable, this wasn't a whim or fashion statement. It was harsh necessity. Sumerian beer was thick, unfiltered, with floating bread particles, barley husks, and pieces of dates. Drinking it the usual way meant swallowing all this suspension. A straw allowed drinking below the foam layer and floating debris without consuming everything along with the beverage. But this drinking method also had deeper social, perhaps even sacred meaning. Sumerians drank from one large ceramic vessel, several people at once, each through their own straw. Perhaps this was also a ritual of trust. One vessel, many straws, a shared drink as a sign of alliance between people or clans. Many Sumerian seals depict scenes where people sit around a large vessel, each drawing through their own straw. The cuneiform sign for beer, a stylized image of a tall jug, was one of the most frequent symbols on clay tablets. Beer is mentioned everywhere, in economic records, religious texts, correspondence, medical prescriptions. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was a form of payment, a universal medium of exchange. Workers who built temples, dug canals, and fired bricks received daily rations, a fixed beer allowance measured in silas. One sila is approximately 1 litre. A skilled craftsman could receive several measures per day. A common labourer, less. Beer was part of daily rations issued as wages. This was payment that couldn't be accumulated but provided energy for the next day's labour. In many early traditions, brewing was closely associated with women, as keepers of household production and the tavern business. Women, as experts in culinary secrets, possessed the recipes. They passed them from mother to daughter, jealously guarding proportions and technological subtleties. Taverns were also often operated by women. The profession of woman brewer was respected and brought income. But over time, when the drink became an economic resource of state importance, control increasingly passed to institutions and officials. And here we approach one of the most famous legal documents of antiquity, the Code of Hammurabi, King of Babylon, dated approximately 1754 BCE. Now we need to dispel a popular myth you've probably heard many times. Supposedly, for bad beer, brewers were drowned in that very beer or thrown into the river. This isn't quite accurate, or rather, not accurate at all. The reality is far more interesting and shows how seriously the state treated control over the beer industry. Let's look at the actual laws from the code. Paragraph 108 states, "If a tavern hostess cheated with measure or price, she should be thrown into water." That is, they drowned not for poor quality, they punished for fraud, for manipulating price and measure, for violating trade regulations. The state strictly controlled beer commerce, and any attempts at deception were punished by death. Paragraph 109 is even more revealing. If conspirators gathered in a tavern, and the tavern hostess, knowing about this, didn't inform authorities, she faced capital punishment. Taverns were viewed by authorities as potential hotbeds of rebellions and political conspiracies, places where people under alcohol's influence could speak too frankly and plan things dangerous to power. Tavern hostesses were effectively turned into state informers, and paragraph 110 addresses an entirely different category. A priestess is forbidden to open a tavern or even enter one for drinking under threat of being burned alive. This was done to maintain the temple's and priesthood's authority. Priestesses had to remain symbols of purity and spirituality, while taverns were associated with the world of carnal pleasures. These laws demonstrate that beer in ancient Babylon wasn't mere entertainment, but an element of state economy, a tool of political control and an object of religious regulation. Every mug of beer was under the king's watchful eye. In 1989, the owner of one of America's first craft breweries, Fritz Maytag, undertook a bold experiment. He attempted to recreate genuine Sumerian beer, precisely following the hymn to Ninkasi. The result was unexpected. The drink turned out about 3.5% alcohol strength, and to many tasters, it felt closer to a fruity dry beverage than familiar hoppy beer. It was sweetish, with fruity notes from dates, but completely without bitterness. Why no bitterness? Because the main ingredient that defines modern beer's taste, hops, would become a key beer ingredient much later in medieval Europe. The Sumerians didn't use it. They added other herbs and spices for flavour and aroma, but hops weren't among them. But now our beer caravan moves on south to the lands of pharaohs, where liquid bread would become payment for building the greatest wonders of the ancient world. Ancient Egypt, liquid bread for gods and builders. If for Sumerians beer was civilization's foundation, for Egyptians it became life itself in the most literal sense. The drink they called heket, though other name variants like henket or tenamu existed, was a daily necessity for absolutely all levels of society. From pharaohs in their gilded palaces to the last worker hauling stones under the blazing sun. From high priests in temples to small children in village huts. Egyptian brewing technology differed from Mesopotamian methods in important details. Egyptians typically made their beer from barley and emmer, an ancient wheat species with hard shells, barely cultivated today. They could sweeten it with fruits like dates. Fermentation was initiated by yeasts preserved in ceramic vessel pores in previous batch sediment and entering from the environment. Perhaps they also used techniques close to bread sourdough. But the key difference was that reconstructed ancient Egyptian methods don't include mandatory wort boiling, as in modern brewing. This is a fundamental distinction. Perhaps such a method made the drink less stable. It spoiled faster, but could retain more nutrients. Heket was thick, more like liquid porridge or modern smoothies than clear beer. Usually low in alcohol, probably several percent, though varying in different cases, especially if the drink was consumed during active fermentation. But incredibly caloric and nutritious. This was food and drink merged in one clay jug, and it was precisely this liquid bread that Egyptian authorities used to pay pyramid builders. These weren't slaves dragging these giant stones as commonly portrayed in popular culture. The workforce consisted of paid and state-provided workers and craftsmen, plus periodically mobilized laborers. The system was closer to civic duty or labor tax than mass-force slavery. Many worked on great constructions during the Nile flood season, when their own fields were submerged and impossible to cultivate, and they received payment for this labor. There's an estimate that workers could receive several liters of beer daily. Famous American archaeologist Patrick McGovern, who devoted his life to studying ancient beverages, speaks of 4 to 5 litres, though other estimates exist, for example, about 1.5 gallons, more than 10 pints, each worker, every single day. This was their wages, their main calorie source, their energy. Archaeology reveals mass food and beverage infrastructure. Near construction sites operated production zones where bread was baked and drinks brewed in enormous volumes. It's even known that one construction crew working on Menkare's pyramid, smallest of Giza's 3 great pyramids, bore a name often translated as Menkare's drunkards, though more cautious interpretations of this inscription exist. But even if the translation isn't literal, the very existence of such graffiti speaks volumes about beer's role in builders' lives. Patrick McGovern once said something that perfectly captures beer's role in pyramid construction. Without sufficient quantities of beer, the pyramids might not have been built. It was a source of nutrition, refreshment, and reward. There would have been a revolt if the beer ran out. But beer in Egypt wasn't just an economic building material, it was foundational to medicine. The famous Ebers Papyrus, one of the world's oldest medical texts, dated approximately 1550 BCE, contains hundreds of recipes, and beer regularly appears in them as both component and carrier for medicinal mixtures. Egyptian doctors used beer as a universal solvent and delivery vehicle for medicinal herbs into the body. The logic was straightforward and, admittedly, not without merit. Alcohol and sugars contained in beer helped extract active substances from plants and made them more bioavailable. Beer was often mixed with various herbs and fats, and these mixtures were infused. External applications were also used. Drinks could include herbs with sedative or consciousness-altering effects. For example, mandrake, a plant containing powerful alkaloids. And yes, ancient Egyptian medicine even had a pregnancy test. A woman had to water barley and emmer wheat grains with her urine. From whether they sprouted and how exactly, conclusions were drawn about pregnancy. Surprisingly, in the 20th century this method was experimentally tested, and it showed about 70% accuracy, though determining the child's sex, as the ancients hoped, was of course impossible this way. In Egypt, several goddesses were associated with beer and intoxication, among them Tenenet, or Chenet, also Hathor, called Lady of Drunkenness. But the most epic beer story in Egyptian mythology is connected with an entirely different goddess, the lion-headed Sekhmet, goddess of war, destruction, and the scorching sun. Legend tells that humanity at some point angered the gods with their sins and lawlessness. The sun god Ra decided to punish them and sent Sekhmet to exterminate humanity. The goddess embraced her task with fury. She began killing people by the thousands, bathing in their blood, devouring their flesh. Her bloodlust was such that even Ra himself became frightened. She was going to destroy everyone to the last person. Ra took pity on humanity and ordered his servants to brew enormous amounts of beer. Some versions speak of thousands of vessels. Then he ordered this drink dyed with red ochre to make it resemble blood. Enormous quantities of this crimson liquid were poured onto the fields where Sekhmet raged. The goddess, intoxicated with bloodlust and mistaking the beer for her enemy's blood, began drinking it. She drank and drank and drank until she had drained all these vessels. Terribly drunk, she collapsed to the ground and slept for several days. When she awoke, her rage had subsided and humanity was saved. So if you believe Egyptian mythology, we all live only thanks to divine beer. Our existence is the result of a sacred hangover suffered by an enraged goddess. There's a proverb attributed to Egypt from approximately the 3rd millennium BCE that sounds remarkably modern. The mouth of a perfectly contented man is filled with beer. Over 4,000 years, human nature, it seems, hasn't changed much. But was beer truly only the domain of the Near East and North Africa? Did only Sumerians and Egyptians think to transform grain into a mildly alcoholic drink? Not at all. While pyramids were being constructed in the Nile Valley, all over the world, completely independently of each other, people were making strikingly similar discoveries. beer beyond the Near East. Humanity's drive toward fermented drinks isn't just a cultural peculiarity of one region, it's a universal, fundamental trait of our species, and we find proof of this literally on all inhabited continents of the planet, in the most diverse cultures that never had contact with each other. Let's travel to China, Yellow River Valley, late Yangshao period at the boundary of the late Neolithic, approximately 3400–2900 BCE. Here, in northern China at Mijiaya, archaeologists excavated remains of what they identified as one of the earliest direct evidence of brewing in East Asia. Not just a place where grain accidentally fermented, but a production complex intended for systematic alcoholic beverage production. Chemical analysis of residues preserved in the porous walls of clay vessels revealed an astonishing picture. Neolithic Chinese made their brew not from barley, as in the Near East, but from a mixture of broomcorn millet, barley, an exotic grain called Job's tears, and even tubers of some wild plants. This was a completely different technological tradition, developed independently. Barley's presence is especially intriguing. The fact is, barley wasn't a typical agricultural crop for ancient China. The climate there better suited millet and rice. So where did barley come from? There's a hypothesis it arrived from the West, from Central Asia, and could be connected to fermentation and brewing practices. That is, the Chinese perhaps specifically imported foreign grain for producing this particular drink. And here's a little-known but absolutely astonishing fact related to fermentation products in China. Do you know why some sections of the Great Wall of China, especially those built during the Ming Dynasty in the 14th to 17th centuries, possess such incredible strength that they still stand today, having survived earthquakes, floods, and centuries of erosion? The secret ingredient of the building mortar was so-called sticky rice soup, paste from sticky rice decoction mixed with slaked lime. Chemists studying this ancient mortar's composition discovered that amylopectin, a special polysaccharide contained in sticky rice, created an organic bond between lime and stone particles that surpassed many modern building mixtures in strength. The technology itself has been known since at least the 4th to 5th centuries CE, so you could say the Great Wall of China was held together by beer's distant cousin, a product of grain processing related to fermentation processes. In ancient India, Vedic texts mention a drink called sura as an intoxicating fermented beverage already in the Rig Veda, written in Vedic Sanskrit in the 2nd millennium BCE. Preparation descriptions and consumption contexts vary across different texts, and attitudes toward it were contradictory. On one hand, it could be used as an offering to gods and consumed as a social drink. On the other, in some traditions, priests were prescribed to abstain from it as something impure. This duality reflects the complex attitude toward intoxicating substances in ancient Indian culture. Now let's cross the Pacific Ocean and travel to pre-Columbian America, where occurred perhaps one of history's most amazing independent inventions of a fermented drink: the Andes, highland valleys in modern Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador. Here local peoples brewed a drink they called chicha, corn beer. The tradition has roots in the Andes' deep antiquity, but is archaeologically confidently documented already in 1st millennium CE societies and later. For the Moche, Nazca, Wari cultures, and later for the Inca Empire, this was a sacred drink, an integral part of religious rituals. Its production technology was diverse and included several methods. Corn can be malted, sprouted to convert starch into sugars. This malt was called jora. But other saccharification methods existed. In some traditions, human saliva was used. Yes, exactly so. Specially selected women, whom in the Inca Empire were called aklas, the chosen ones, serving at temples and with the ruler, in some traditions participated in ritual beverage production. The method was simple but ingenious. They chewed corn flour or cooked corn dough. The enzyme tyalin, that very amylase contained in all mammals' saliva that helps us digest starch, did all the work right in the mouth. Starch broke down into simple sugars, Then this chewed mass was deposited into large clay vats with water, where fermentation began under wild yeast's action. Yes, it sounds unappetizing to modern sensibilities, but this was a brilliant biotechnological solution to a problem, demonstrating deep empirical understanding of fermentation processes. Archaeologists conducting excavations at the ancient Cerro Baul settlement in Peru, belonging to the Wari culture and dated approximately 600–1050 CE, discovered in chicha remains traces of Peruvian pepper tree fruits, the Schinus mole plant. It was added for flavour and aroma, with possible additional effects that remain subject to interpretation. Chicha was a mandatory element of all religious rites. It was poured on the ground as an offering to gods, especially Pachamama, Mother Earth. It was consumed during all important holidays, weddings, funerals, initiation ceremonies. For the Incas, refusing to drink offered chicha was the gravest insult, almost sacrilege. And in Africa, south of the Sahara, since time immemorial they brewed and still brew beer from sorghum, a grain ideally adapted to the hot, arid climate of the African savanna. In many societies of this region, sorghum brewing was predominantly a female domain and an important ritual element. Recipes were passed from mother to daughter, from generation to generation, as precious heritage. Sorghum beer was an integral part of all important life events: weddings, funerals, naming ceremonies, prayers for rain during drought, harvest festivals. All these completely independent discoveries on different continents, in cultures isolated from each other, prove a fundamental truth. The drive toward fermented drinks, toward alcohol, toward altered states of consciousness, toward social rituals connected with collective consumption of psychoactive substances, this isn't chance, not a cultural anomaly. This is a deep foundational trait of human nature. This is part of what makes us human. But what happened when the beer culture of the cold north collided face to face with the wine culture of the sunny south? A great confrontation began, a cultural war of beverages whose echoes still resonate today. Antiquity, when grape defeated grain. In the ancient world, in ancient Greece and Rome, in civilizations that laid the foundations of European culture, philosophy, law and literature, beer found itself relegated to history's margins. Here wine reigned supreme. Wine was the drink of gods, a symbol of civilization, a measure of cultural sophistication. And beer? Beer was despised. This was the barbarians' drink, the savages, people who didn't know life's true pleasures. The great Roman encyclopedic scholar Pliny the Elder, in his monumental Natural History, written in the 1st century CE, reflecting on Western people's grain drinks, exclaimed with undisguised indignation, "Alas, what wonderful inventiveness in vice! A way was found to make even water intoxicating." For a refined Roman nose accustomed to aged wine's bouquet from Falernian or Massic vineyards, the smell of grain fermentation was repulsive. Sour, yeasty, sometimes rancid aromas of fermenting barley seemed to them a stench worthy of a livestock pen. Romans sincerely believed barley and wheat were good exclusively for baking bread or feeding horses and donkeys. Drinking a grain fermentation product seemed to them a perversion, a sign of barbarism and lack of taste. In Rome's cultural hierarchy, beer was considered a drink of the peripheries and outsiders, crude, primitive, unworthy of Roman refinement. A true Roman should drink wine, a beverage that gives courage, eloquence, martial spirit. But the Roman Empire was vast. It stretched from North Africa's scorching sands to Britain's foggy marshes, and on its edges, in northern provinces where grapes simply wouldn't grow due to cold climate, beer thrived. Each region had its own name for this drink. In Gaul it was called Cervesia, though variants Caviesia and Cerevisia existed. In Spain, Calia and Syria. In conquered Egypt the ancient name Zithum persisted. Emperor Julian the Apostate, ruling in the 4th century CE, encountering Gallic beer during his military campaigns, was so shocked and disgusted by this drink that he even wrote a satirical epigram about it in Greek. In it, he addresses this grain beverage with contemptuous bewilderment, contrasting it with noble wine. The meaning of his mockery is this: "Who are you, and whence do you come? I don't recognize you. Dionysus smells of nectar, and you, of goat. Due to lack of grapes, Celts brewed you from grain. You should be called Demetrius, not Dionysus. You're born of grain, not grapevine." This wasn't merely literary jest. This was a clash of two completely different olfactory and taste cultures. For someone raised on wine, with its fruity, tannic, slightly acidic aromas, grain fermentation offered a completely alien, unpleasant bouquet. But while in Rome, philosophers and poets sang wine's praises, and aristocrats hosted feasts where rivers of Falernian flowed, on the empire's northern borders life followed different laws. Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus, describing in his work Germania, written at the turn of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Germanic tribes' life and customs, noted, "For drink they have an intoxicating liquor obtained through fermentation of barley or wheat. It remotely resembles wine." Remotely. For a Roman, this was a feeble, pitiful attempt by barbarians to imitate civilization's noble drink. Celts, Germans, Britons. All northern Europe's peoples brewed their ales from various grains: barley, wheat, oats, rye, millet. For flavour and aroma they added wild herbs, wild honey, berries. Their beer was cloudy, strong, often sourish, completely unlike what we drink today. When Romans first arrived in Britain in the mid-1st century BCE, they entered a world where the standard drink was grain infusion. At first, legionaries wrinkled their noses and demanded wine. But Britain didn't produce wine. It had to be imported from Gaul or Italy, which was expensive and logistically challenging. Gradually soldiers, especially those quartered in remote garrisons along Hadrian's Wall, the grandiose border wall in northern Britain, grew accustomed to local ale. Archaeologists excavating the Roman Fort Vindolanda at Hadrian's Wall discovered unique finds, wooden tablets with Latin inscriptions. This was correspondence of soldiers, officers, merchants, letters home, business notes, supply lists, and one of the most famous tablets, dated approximately 97-105 CE, contains a direct request: "Serusum camilitones non habunt, rogo ubeas miti." Comrades have no beer. I ask you to order it sent. By the end of their service, many Roman legionaries became genuine connoisseurs of local beer. Thus, in the ancient era, formed Europe's great division along the Grape South, Grain North axis. The Mediterranean South, wine territory. Northern Europe, beer territory. This cultural boundary long influenced beverages' tastes and prestige, though the actual map was always more complex, full of exceptions and interweaving. But symbolically, the division remained profound. Romans looked at beer-drinking Germans and Celts as barbarians, and they looked at effeminate wine lovers as weaklings unable to endure a real warrior's drink. But when the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, under the onslaught of those same barbarians, a completely new era began for beer, an era that would transform it from barbarians' drink into saints' drink. The era of monasteries, secret knowledge preserved behind thick stone walls, and one plant that would forever change beer's taste. Early Middle Ages, monasteries, women, and hops. After the last Western Roman emperor laid down his purple mantle, Europe plunged into what would later be called the Dark Ages. Cities emptied, roads deteriorated, libraries burned. But amid this chaos emerged islands of order and knowledge, monasteries. Here, behind thick stone walls, under soaring church vaults, brewing experienced its rebirth and transformed from craft into art. Benedictine monks especially excelled at this. Their order was founded by St. Benedict of Nursia in the 6th century. The order's rule encouraged manual labour and monastery self-sufficiency. Pray and work, ora et labora. And one of the most important works became brewing. Large Benedictine abbeys, such as the famous St. Gallen Monastery in Switzerland, by the 9th century represented true economic complexes. The St. Gallen plan, compiled around 820–830 and preserved to this day, shows an ideal model of a large monastery, with 3 separate brewing buildings, malt houses, huge cellars for storing barrels. Everything was conceived with the pedantry that would become the hallmark of German lands. Monks were the most educated people of their time. They could read and write, knew Latin, studied ancient authors' works. They approached brewing not as simple peasants working by chance, but as methodical experimenters. They recorded recipes, compared results, perfected technologies. They transformed brewing into a systematic craft long before the concept of scientific method appeared. The plan provided separate brewing facilities for different needs. One for the brethren, for the monks themselves, another for honoured guests and the abbot, a third for pilgrims and poor travellers to whom the monastery provided shelter and sustenance. This wasn't greed, but a thoughtful system. Weak beer was safe to drink, provided calories, but didn't intoxicate people who had to set off on further journeys in the morning. It was in monastic walls, in scriptoria where monks copied ancient manuscripts, that a transformation occurred that would forever change beer's history. Hops, a plant used before, began to be systematically described and increasingly widely applied in brewing as the primary preservative and bitterness source. Hildegard of Bingen, a name every beer enthusiast should know. Benedictine nun, living in the 12th century in modern Germany. Mystic, visionary, composer, physician, botanist, one of her time's most extraordinary minds. A woman who dared write theological treatises and preach before bishops in an era when women were strictly forbidden to do so. She created Ordo Virtutum, one of the earliest known musical dramatic works of the Middle Ages. She wrote about medicine with astonishing frankness and attention to human body details unprecedented for her time, and it was she in her treatise Physica who directly wrote that hops' bitterness restrains beverages' spoilage and helps them preserve longer. This wasn't discovering the plant. Hops were known before, but systematic, authoritative description of its preservative and aromatic properties. Before this, beer in Northern Europe was often brewed with addition of an herb mixture called Grut. And this wasn't just a flavour seasoning. Grut consisted of very different regional mixtures. Their composition could include bog myrtle, yarrow, wormwood, heather, and sometimes plants with stronger effects. Some herbs could produce unpleasant or heavy effects, though the notion of medieval beer as a guaranteed hallucinogenic drink is already exaggeration and legend. But Grut wasn't just a recipe. This was a monopoly, a source of enormous income. In many cities and territories, the right to produce and sell Grut, Grutrecht, was controlled by secular authorities and the church, transforming the mixture into a tax administrative monopoly. Every brewer was obligated to purchase Grut from official suppliers at an established price. This was medieval oil, a commodity you couldn't do without, and which brought monopoly owners fabulous profits. And hops grew in wild thickets everywhere. Any peasant could gather it, any city dweller. It was free. And when brewers began understanding that hops worked even better, it not only flavoured beer but dramatically increased its shelf life thanks to antiseptic properties, a quiet revolution began. Hops produced a completely different effect. Instead of possible unpredictability of herbal mixtures, stable, pleasant bitterness, and mild intoxication with gentle drowsiness. Some historians believe mass transition to hops could have influenced even Northern Europe's cultural climate, but Grut monopoly owners weren't going to surrender without a fight. The transition to hops struck at the interests of those controlling Grut, so hops met resistance, regulation, attempted bans, disputes about what exactly could be called beer. Brewers caught violating rules were fined, sometimes imprisoned. But hops prevailed, slowly but inexorably. By early modern times, hops dominated, and Grut in most regions became a rarity or local tradition. In English tradition, Already from the 15th century they began distinguishing two beverage types. Old, without hops, ale. New, hopped, beer. Later these terms' meaning shifted and partially merged, but the distinction's roots reach back precisely to that botanical revolution. But who actually brewed all this beer in the Middle Ages? Monks in monasteries? Yes. But in ordinary cities and villages, their brewing was very often done by women. In medieval England, women brewers were called by a special term, alewives, or brewsters. The suffix ester was originally a feminine suffix in English, later becoming gender-neutral, just as spinster meant a woman who spins. The term brewster is historically documented precisely as woman brewer. For many women, especially widows, this was one of the few legal ways to earn a living, to gain at least some economic independence in a world where almost everything was controlled by men. They brewed beer in large cauldrons in their kitchens, using the same tools they use for cooking food. They sold surplus to neighbours right from home or at the city market, and they had their own professional attributes that made them noticeable and recognisable. To stand out in the crowd at a noisy city market where every merchant shouted about their goods, some women brewers wore tall pointed hats. The higher the hat, the better you were seen from afar. At the house entrance or above the market stall they could display a broom or long pole, stake. This was a sign that a fresh batch of beer was ready for sale. For brewing they used large black iron cauldrons in which they boiled wort. And almost all kept cats, faithful helpers in fighting mice and rats that could spoil precious grain. Tall pointed hat, large black cauldron, broom, cat. Sound familiar? Exactly. The classic witch image we know from fairy tales and films. Many modern historians propose a provocative theory. They believe the similarity between women brewers' attributes and the witch image isn't coincidence. Perhaps the stereotypical evil witch image is partly connected to systematic demonization of independent women brewers that occurred in the 15th to 17th centuries. However, the witch archetype has many sources and cultural layers, so this connection is better viewed as a hypothesis, not the sole explanation. What happened? Brewing transformed from small household craft into large, highly profitable business. Large urban breweries appeared, capable of producing hundreds and thousands of litres. Men wanted to control this business. They began uniting into professional guilds that passed laws effectively pushing women out of commercial brewing. But simply pushing out successful women brewers wasn't easy. Many had regular clientele, reputation, secret recipes. And here witch hunts came into play, mass hysteria that swept Europe. Accusing an undesirable competitor of witchcraft was easy. She brews strange potions in a cauldron? Suspicious. She has a cat. Traditional witch helper in folk superstitions? Evidence. She wears a strange hat and places a broom at the door. Ominous signs. In some places, women's participation in brewing was substantial, but over time their representation sharply decreased. Some were pushed out by laws and guild restrictions, others by social pressure, and some fell under the wheels of the Inquisition or secular courts accusing them of witchcraft. But despite all these tragic vicissitudes, despite religious wars and economic upheavals, beer remained one of medieval Europe's staple beverages. Everyone drank it, from kings to beggars, adults and children, regularly. And one reason was simple and brutal. In cities, water quality was often problematic. Raw water from rivers, wells, streams could be dangerous. It could contain pathogens causing dysentery, typhoid fever, other intestinal infections. People of that time didn't know about microbes' existence, but they knew perfectly well from experience. Drink water from a contaminated source, and there's a strong chance of falling ill. Mildly alcoholic beer was often valued for calories, flavour and storage stability. The brewing process included boiling. This killed many pathogens. Mild alcohol and hops created an environment less favourable for bacterial reproduction. Beer wasn't just a beverage, it was liquid sustenance, a source of calories, B vitamins. It was, of course, often diluted with water, especially for children, but regular consumption of weak beer was commonplace. Beer was such an important part of life that it even entered saints' lives. St. Bridget of Ireland, patroness of Ireland, living in the 5th-6th centuries, is venerated by the Catholic Church as brewer's patroness. Medieval Irish monks attributed many beer miracles to her. According to one legend, she transformed water prepared for washing lepers into excellent beer to comfort these unfortunates. Another story tells how she provided quality ale to 18 different churches for all Easter days with one small barrel, an obvious beer multiplication miracle. She's credited with a poetic prayer that sounds almost comical to modern ears, but reflects medieval piety. I would like to have a great lake of fine ale for the King of Kings. I would like the heavenly host to be drinking it through time eternal. Paradise envisioned as an endless feast with an inexhaustible beer lake, quite in the spirit of medieval Irish Christianity. Other monastic legends tell of St. Columbanus, founder of the famous Bobbio Abbey in Italy in the 7th century. He established a very strict charter in his monastery, with harsh punishments for the slightest transgressions, including, for spilled beer, a monk who dropped or spilled even a drop of precious drink had to bear penance. Legend tells of the God's barrel miracle. Once a cellarer monk responsible for supplies forgot to close the tap on a huge beer barrel and departed. When he returned hours later in horror, expecting to see an emptied barrel and a pool of beer on the floor, he found the barrel full to the brim and the floor dry. Not a drop had flowed out. The monks decided that the Lord himself, knowing St. Columbanus's charter strictness, held the beer inside the barrel to save the poor cellarer from punishment. These stories may seem naive or comical to us, but they demonstrate how deeply beer was integrated into the Middle Ages' religious and daily life. This wasn't sin, not vice. It was God's gift, as natural and necessary as daily bread. But the era of medieval monasteries and home breweries was drawing to a close. Modern times were arriving, the era of great geographical discoveries, scientific revolutions, absolute monarchies, and powerful merchant guilds. Brewing was emerging from kitchens and monastic cellars onto the broad stage of major politics and world trade. Late Middle Ages and modern times. Laws, standards, and globalization. When brewing transformed from monastic and household craft into a powerful urban industry capable of generating enormous profits, what inevitably accompanies any big business appeared: state regulation, laws, taxes, and struggle for market control. April 23rd, 1516. Bavaria, a duchy in Germany's heartland. Dukes William IV and Ludwig VI convened a council and issued a decree that would enter history under the name Reinheitsgebot, the beer purity law. Only 3 ingredients are permitted for beer production: water, barley, and hops. Period. No other grains, no herbs, no additives. Yeast wasn't mentioned in the law for a simple reason. In early 16th century, people still didn't understand fermentation's true nature and yeast's role as living organisms. Fermentation was considered something like a divine miracle, or mysterious process of spontaneous transformation. Officially, the law was adopted to protect consumers from dubious and potentially dangerous additives. Too many charlatans added anything to beer, from fly agaric mushrooms to enhance intoxicating effect to soot to provide dark colour. Additionally, the law finally eradicated Groot use, transferring the entire industry to hops. But Reinheitsgebot had a hidden, purely economic subtext. By banning wheat and rye for beer, authorities preserved these more valuable grains exclusively for bread baking. Wheat bread was the diet's foundation, and in poor harvest years, when every grain was precious, the last thing the state needed was brewers purchasing wheat for their needs. The law effectively prevented famine by directing grain flows where they were more critically needed. But even here, Bavarian dukes created a loophole for their own benefit. Wheat beer could be brewed only by special privileges. First, such a monopoly on popular Weissbier, white wheat beer, production was received by the noble Degenberg family in 1567 by decision of Duke Albrecht V. And after this family's extinction in 1602, the lucrative monopoly passed to the ruling Wittelsbach dynasty itself and became a ducal privilege. A comical situation resulted. A commoner brewing wheat beer faced punishment. This violated the purity law, wasted valuable grain needed for bread. But the Duke brewed tons of Weissbier and sold it at enormous profit, and this was completely legal because he was the law. So the famous Reinheitsgebot was not only consumer protection and food security measure, but also an unfair competition tool, competitor elimination, and enrichment of the powerful. At this same time, in the Age of Discovery, when European powers' ships ploughed all world oceans, beer began its journey across the planet. Colonizers brought with them not only weapons, diseases, and Christianity, but also their cultural habits, their cuisine, their beverages. English pilgrims landing on Massachusetts shores in early 17th century made a brewery one of their first New World constructions. Spanish conquistadors began growing barley in Andes highlands and brewing beer in Mexico and Peru, displacing traditional chicha. It's precisely in the 16th, 17th centuries that those classic beer styles we know and love today begin forming. In 18th century London, porter was born. Dark, dense, hearty beer with characteristic burnt flavour. It was created specifically for workers, porters, carriers, dockers. The very name porter comes from the English word meaning carrier. This was affordable caloric beer that provided energy for heavy physical labour. In Belgium, Trappist abbeys in modern times indeed made brewing a sustainable monastery income source. Many famous Trappist breweries brewing strong, complex, multifaceted ales took shape already in the 19th century, perfecting monastic beer traditions brewed for their own needs and according to strict Cistercian order branch spiritual principles. And in Bavaria, in the Alps' cold foothills, a technology was born that in the next century would transform the entire beer world. Local brewers noticed a curious pattern. Beer they brewed in winter and stored in deep cellars or natural caves filled with ice, fermented somehow differently, slower, quieter, and turned out cleaner, more transparent, with milder flavour. In Bavaria, there were even summer brewing restrictions. From 1553, bans on brewing during hot months were in effect. This stimulated long cold storage and strengthened winter production practice. Brewers began specifically aging beer barrels in ice dungeons. The process could take weeks or months. They called such beer lager, from the German verb lagern, meaning to store age. Bavarian brewers didn't yet know they were unwittingly cultivating a completely different biological yeast species, bottom-fermenting yeasts, Saccharomyces pastorianus, a hybrid with cold-resistant component, which unlike ordinary top-fermenting yeasts thrives in cold and settles to the container bottom. But they knew the result was excellent. In late 18th century, one of history's most legendary styles was born, Russian Imperial Stout. Its origin story is connected to geopolitics and trade routes. In the 1780s, English brewers began exporting to the Russian Empire, to St. Petersburg, a special variety of super-strong dark ale, about 12% alcohol strength, sometimes even higher. Such beer was dense, almost syrup-like, with intense roasted malt flavour, chocolate, coffee notes. It perfectly endured the long sea journey across the Baltic Sea, didn't spoil from rocking and temperature changes. Legend, which can neither be completely confirmed nor completely refuted, claims this drink was adored by Empress Catherine the Great. She supposedly ordered entire shipments specifically for the royal court. In honour of this crowned admirer, the style received its grand name, Russian Imperial Stout. Beer became part of European folklore and popular culture. The image of King Gambrinus appeared, a cheerful, good-natured monarch with a huge, foaming mug in hand. His statues and images decorated breweries, taverns, pubs throughout Europe from Lisbon to Warsaw. Who was this Gambrinus? The probable historical prototype is considered Jan the Amnerd, Duke of Brabant, living in the 13th century. He was known as a great lover of good ale and generous patron of his duchy's brewers. Popular rumour transformed him into a semi-mythical character, beer's inventor, eternal life-lover, symbol of life's joy. Gambrinus became the unofficial patron saint of brewers, an alternative to church saints. By late 18th century, beer had definitively ceased being simply a thirst-quenching drink or village women's craft. This was a global industry operating by market laws, regulated by the state, connected by trade routes spanning the entire world. But the real revolution that would transform brewing from art based on experience and intuition into exact science based on chemistry and biology was still ahead. This revolution occurred in the 19th century, century of steam, electricity, and microscope. 19th century, scientific revolution and industrial transformation. The 19th century changed beer forever, and it all began with a man whose name every schoolchild knows, but few associate him with beer. Louis Pasteur, great French scientist, saviour of millions of lives, founder of microbiology. In 1856 to 1857, working in his Lille laboratory, Pasteur was engaged in what seemed a mundane applied task. Local producers approached him with a problem. Their products constantly spoiled, soured, acquired disgusting smell. They were losing money and didn't understand why this was happening. Pasteur took samples, placed liquid drops under a microscope and observed what had been a mystery for millennia. Fermentation isn't a divine miracle, not a mysterious process of spontaneous generation, not alchemical transformation. It's the work of tiny living beings. Yeast themselves had been observed before him. Already in the 1830s, these oval cells were examined under microscope, but it was Pasteur who proved with experiments iron logic that precisely they, these microorganisms and their invisible enemies, foreign bacteria, determine every barrel's fate. These single-celled fungi consume sugar and excrete as metabolic waste two substances, ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. That's all the magic that transformed ordinary grain infusion into an intoxicating drink over 11,000 years. In 1876, already a world-famous scientist, Pasteur published the fundamental work Studies on Beer. In this work, he not only described fermentation's nature in detail, but also proposed a solution to brewers' primary problem, finished beverage spoilage. He described and scientifically substantiated heating to a certain temperature, around 55 degrees Celsius, as a way to prevent beer diseases, kill harmful microbes without destroying product taste. What would later be called pasteurization, and what would save not only beer but millions of human lives. Interestingly, one of Pasteur's main motivations wasn't pure science, but national pride bordering on revenge. After France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, he wanted to prove that French science, French industry, French beer could be superior to German. This was his personal war against Prussia, which he waged not with weapons but with knowledge. Pasteur's work was continued by Dane Emil Christian Hansen, working in the research laboratory of the Carlsberg Brewery in Copenhagen. In 1883, he made the next fundamental breakthrough. Hansen, for the first time in human history, managed to isolate a pure culture of brewing yeast, separate good yeast producing proper taste and aroma from wild yeast and bacteria that spoil beer, making it sour, cloudy, with unpleasant smell. And already in November that year, this pure culture entered production. From laboratory experiment to industrial implementation took mere months. This ended beer disease, unpredictable batch spoilage that had been brewers' curse since time immemorial. Now you could be certain each brew would yield identical, stable results. And the Carlsberg owner, J.C. Jacobsen, a man who founded not only the brewery, but also Carlsberg Foundation, a scientific fund existing to this day, made an act that seemed insane in the capitalist world. He didn't patent this revolutionary discovery. He made the lager yeast culture Hansen developed, then called Saccharomyces carlsbergensis, today more often Saccharomyces pastorianus, free and accessible to brewers worldwide. Anyone could write to the Carlsberg laboratory and receive a pure yeast culture sample completely free of charge. This was a gift to humanity. Jacobson believed science should serve everyone, not be one person's or one company's enrichment tool. Science invaded brewing from other directions too. Precise thermometer invention allowed controlling mash temperature to the degree. Before this, brewers determined water heat by dipping their hand in it, or by steam intensity over the vat. Saccharometers and hydrometers allowed precisely measuring wort density, predicting beer's final alcohol strength before fermentation began. Brewing ceased being a lottery where success depended on luck and saints' blessing. It became an engineering process with predictable results. But the most revolutionary technological breakthrough was German engineer Carl von Linde's invention. In the 1870s, this young Munich Technical University professor received an order from the Spaten brewery, one of Bavaria's largest. The task was simple and simultaneously seemingly impossible. Create a machine capable of producing cold on an industrial scale. In 1873, von Linde created the first working industrial refrigeration unit for Spaten. This was a revolution. Previously, for brewing lager, bottom-fermented beer, natural caves filled with ice or deep cellars were required. Lager could be brewed only in winter when temperature allowed slow fermentation. In summer, production ceased. Artificial refrigeration destroyed these limitations. Now lager could be brewed year-round, in any climate, even in the tropics. No longer necessary to stock tons of ice that melted and required constant replenishment. Lager, clean, stable, refreshing beer with mild flavour, began its triumphal march across the planet, gradually displacing traditional ales. And the culmination of all these technological and scientific achievements was an event that occurred in a small Czech city, Plzeň. In 1838, local brewers were extremely dissatisfied with their product's quality. Their beer was dark, cloudy, often sour. In protest, they once poured 36 barrels of particularly unsuccessful batch right on the city hall steps. City authorities decided to act radically. They built a new, modern brewery and hired Bavarian master brewer Joseph Groll. And in 1842, Groll brewed the first batch of completely new beer. He combined several factors that accidentally came together in perfect harmony. Local light malt that Czech malt houses learned to produce by roasting barley at lower temperatures. Famous Saaz hops, perhaps the world's finest aromatic hop. Soft Plzeň water with low mineral content, and Bavarian cold fermentation technology. The result was the first Pilsner, a new type of light lager that would become the standard for half the planet. Pilsner Urquell, Plzeň Original. Golden, crystal clear, sparkling. This was a revelation. People of that time had never before seen such beer. Everything they knew was dark, cloudy, opaque. Pilsner's appearance coincided with industrial revolution in the glass industry. Glass mugs and glasses became accessible and affordable. Previously, beer was consumed from opaque clay, wood, or pewter vessels. Colour didn't matter, but now drinking from transparent glass became fashionable and prestigious, and it turned out that the new Pilsner's amber beauty in a glass mug was itself a colossal marketing advantage. Beer became not only a drink but also a spectacle. Lights play in golden liquid, rising carbon dioxide bubbles, snow-white foam, all this was mesmerising. Railroad development allowed quickly delivering Pilsner barrels to any corner of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and beyond, throughout Europe. Within several decades, Pilsner became the most copied style in beer history. Almost every brewery began producing its light lager version. But industrial-scale production sometimes led to catastrophes exceeding imagination. On October 17, 1814, in London occurred a tragedy that entered history as the Great Beer Flood. At the Mew and Company brewery in the Tottenham Court Road area, an iron hoop burst on a giant wooden vat nearly 7 metres high and about 6 metres in diameter. The vat instantly shattered into splinters, and between 600,000 and 1.5 million litres, Estimates vary, but the scale is monstrous in any case, of dark, thick porter gushed out. The beer wave demolished the brewery wall, destroyed neighbouring houses, flooded basements and streets of the impoverished St. Giles district. 8 people died. Eleanor Cooper, a 14-year-old girl. 5 perished at a wake for a 2-year-old child. They were struck right in the house of mourning. Most victims were in basement dwellings where the beer wave rushed with terrifying force, leaving no chance of survival. The most cynical aspect of this tragedy, its legal consequences. The coroner's investigation recognised the deaths as unfortunate accident, and the court concluded act of God, an act for which no one bears responsibility. The brewery owners were not only freed from any compensation to victims' families, but the company received a refund of excise tax paid on lost beer, which saved it from bankruptcy. Because this porter had already had taxes paid to the state, the 19th century made beer modern, but the 20th century prepared for it the harshest trials in all its long history. Wars, bans, simplification to tastelessness, and almost complete disappearance of the diversity accumulated over millennia. Beer's history in the 20th century is a story of survival. 20th century. Wars, Prohibition, Uniformity, and Craft Rebellion. The 20th century began for beer with a catastrophe that engulfed all of Europe. World War I, millions of men went to the front, the economy restructured for war footing, and one of the first victims of this total war was the beer industry. Governments of warring countries sharply restricted alcohol production. Every grain of barley, every kilogram of wheat was needed for bread, for the army, for survival. Grain for beer was considered unaffordable luxury when soldiers in trenches starved. In Great Britain, the government not only cut production volumes, but also pressed on alcohol strength through harsh restrictions on wort density and available raw materials. War radically intensified regulation. Pub operating hours were strictly limited. And across the Atlantic, a movement was gathering force that would strike beer harder than any world war. The temperance movement. Its roots reached back to the 19th century, to Protestant religious groups that considered alcohol the source of all social ills: poverty, family violence, crime, degradation. These activists, among whom were many women, for decades conducted campaigns, held marches, lobbied laws, and on January 17, 1920, they achieved their goal. In the United States of America, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution came into force, prohibiting production, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. Prohibition began, which would last 13 agonizing years, until December 5, 1933. The results were catastrophic for the legal beer industry. Hundreds of American breweries, many existing for decades and built by German immigrants who brought their traditions to the New World, closed forever. Entire brewer dynasties went bankrupt. Some tried to survive by switching to lemonade production, ice cream, malt extracts for baking. It was precisely during Prohibition that breweries sought any workarounds. They produced so-called near beer, with alcohol strength no higher than 0.5% to formally not violate the law. They sold malt syrups and extracts, often disguised as tonics or food additives. After World War II, which again devastated Europe, the beer industry entered a new phase, corporate consolidation phase. Economic logic was simple and brutal. Small regional breweries couldn't compete with giants that possessed huge capital, modern equipment, wide distribution networks, powerful advertising. A wave of takeovers and mergers began. Throughout Europe and America, large corporations bought up small family breweries. Sometimes they preserved old names and brands but changed recipes, simplified production, standardized taste. More often, they simply closed acquired breweries and transferred production to their factories. The era of mega breweries arrived. Huge factories capable of producing millions of litres of beer per year. In pursuit of profit, corporations strove to maximally reduce costs and accelerate production. How was this accomplished? Aging time was shortened. Instead of traditional long maturation, beer underwent accelerated processing. Instead of whole hop cones, cheap hop extracts were used. Instead of pure barley malt, rice or corn was added. They're cheaper and provide more neutral taste. Beer's taste became increasingly neutral, watery, characterless. The philosophy was simple. To please everyone, beer shouldn't have distinctive character. It should be light, refreshing, inoffensive, not too bitter, not too sweet, not too strong, a universal product for mass consumers. By the 1970s, the global mass market was dominated by light industrial lager. Many regional styles retreated into shadow or contracted to local niches. It seemed genuine beer, diverse, interesting, with taste and character, had died forever. That the world was condemned to eternally drink watery lager from identical cans. But even in darkest times, remarkable, almost absurd stories occurred that demonstrated how important this drink was to people. During World War II, British military command faced an unexpected problem. Troops fighting Japanese forces in Burma jungles and Pacific islands suffered not only from enemies and tropical diseases, their morale was catastrophically deteriorating. Soldiers were depressed, apathetic, the number of mental disorders increased. Military psychologists conducted research and reached an unexpected conclusion. One of the most important causes of demoralization was absence of familiar English beer. For mid-20th century Britons, a pint of ale in a pub after work wasn't just tradition. It was a way to cope with stress, a symbol of home, normal, peaceful life. And in the tropics there was neither ale nor pubs. And then a brilliant decision was made. The British Admiralty ordered the mine-layer HMS Menestheus converted into a floating brewery. A complete brewing installation of stainless steel was mounted on the ship, capable of producing 250 barrels of beer per week, about 40,000 litres. Distilled seawater was used for brewing. Malt extract and hops were brought from Britain. The ship also featured a cinema and dance hall, transforming it into a floating recreation and entertainment centre. However, the story had a comical continuation. The first test brew occurred on December 31st, 1945, in Vancouver. That is, already after Japan's capitulation, after the war's end. But the floating brewery didn't go to waste. It became a genuine hit among occupation forces in Japan. English soldiers awaiting demobilization on foreign soil could board this ship and drink authentic British ale, watch movies, dance, a piece of home amid a foreign country's ruins. And so, when it seemed beer had finally transformed into a uniform industrial product without soul and history, rebellion began. Quiet, barely noticeable at first, but gaining strength each year, the craft revolution. One of Europe's taste rebellion starting points was Britain, 1971, March 16th. Four friends, Michael Hardman, Graham Lees, Bill Mellor and Jim Makin, returned from vacation in Western Ireland. In evenings they sat in traditional Irish pubs, drank genuine living ale still maturing in barrels in the cellar, and discussed how terrible beer had become back home in England. Large brewing corporations aggressively promoted a new beer type, keg, pasteurized, artificially carbonated, poured from metal barrels under pressure. This beer could be stored for months, was easy to transport, required no special conditions. But it was dead. It had no living yeast, no taste complexity that natural maturation provides. And these four friends decided they'd had enough. They founded an organisation with a straightforward name, CAMRA, Campaign for Real Ale. Their goal was saving traditional living beer and British pub culture. They started small, published lists of pubs where you could still find genuine cask ale, held tastings, wrote newspaper articles, staged protests. At first they were considered eccentrics, a bunch of nostalgic enthusiasts wanting to turn back time, but the movement grew. Thousands of people tired of monotony joined. CAMRA became a real force, and across the Atlantic the American microbrewery wave was simultaneously developing. In America, where Prohibition had nearly destroyed beer culture, and after its repeal the market was monopolised by several giant corporations. Small independent breweries began appearing. Fritz Maytag in 1965 bought out the dying old Anchor Brewery in San Francisco and began brewing traditional styles according to old recipes. Ken Grossman in 1980 founded Sierra Nevada in California and focused on brightly hopped American ales. Jim Koch launched Samuel Adams in Boston in mid-80s. These weren't just breweries, this was a movement. People who refused to accept that beer is tasteless yellow water from an aluminum can. They read old books, studied forgotten recipes, experimented with ingredients, made mistakes, started over. The first years were challenging. Large corporations used their power to keep newcomers off store shelves and out of bars. Licensing laws created bureaucratic obstacles. Banks refused loans for dubious projects. But enthusiasts didn't surrender. By the 2000s, the craft revolution swept the entire world. In Germany, young brewers appeared who dared violate the sacred Reinheitsgebot. In Italy, wine country, a powerful craft scene emerged. In Japan, Brazil, Australia, everywhere. Thousands of new small independent breweries opened worldwide. They offered an alternative to mass lager. Incredible, exotic, sometimes completely audacious beer varieties appeared. Beer with raspberries, with coffee, with oysters, with pumpkin, with chili pepper. Sour beer aged in oak barrels from wine or whiskey. Beer with 12, 15, even 20% alcohol strength, more like liqueur. Beer again became what it had been for thousands of years. Art, creativity, experiment. Each brewery could have its own identity, its own signature, its own philosophy. And while this quiet craft revolution raged on Earth, beer reached for new heights, in the most literal sense of these words, into orbit. On the International Space Station, alcohol is prohibited by operational rules and practice. This is NASA's strict regulation which isn't violated. But the Soviet, then Russian space program approached this question differently. Formally, alcohol was banned, but according to program participants' recollections, small amounts of cognac sometimes secretly ended up aboard Salyut and Mir stations and were used as rare psychological relief. Months in a confined metal cylinder, far from Earth, without possibility of going outside for fresh air, without change of scenery. This is colossal stress. A small shot once a week was a way to remain human. And in 2017, American brewing corporation Budweiser launched an unusual experiment. Containers with barley seeds were sent to the International Space Station. The goal: study how barley sprouts in microgravity conditions. How do roots behave, which on Earth grow downward following gravity, when down doesn't exist? Can barley normally germinate in space at all? The experiment succeeded. Barley sprouted, though behaved not quite as on Earth. This was the first step in a very long-term, almost fantastic program. People from Budweiser seriously discussed how someday, perhaps in decades, when humanity begins Mars colonization, beer will need to be brewed there. Bringing it from Earth is too expensive and impractical. So learning to grow barley and hops on site in Martian greenhouses or underground farms is necessary. The idea seems absurd, but if you consider it, it's absolutely logical. Beer has always been with us, from civilization's first steps to the space age. Why should it remain on Earth when we venture toward the stars? But before looking into the future and dreaming of Martian breweries, we need to dispel several medical myths that accompanied beer throughout its history, and that were sometimes not just erroneous but dangerously misleading. Medical myths and curiosities. For centuries, beer was attributed healing properties. Sometimes there were grounds for this. Sometimes these were merely superstitions, and sometimes criminally dangerous delusions that damaged lives. The 20th century's most famous and most egregious medical myth is connected with dark Irish stout Guinness. In the first half of the 20th century in Britain and Ireland, stout was often perceived as a tonic, and some doctors indeed recommended Guinness, including to pregnant women and nursing mothers, as well as people after operations and illnesses. The reasoning was this: Guinness stout is rich in iron, necessary for blood formation. Pregnant and nursing women often suffer from anemia, iron deficiency in blood, so they need to drink Guinness to replenish the deficit. Logical? At first glance, yes. Guinness Company itself actively exploited this idea. Their famous advertising slogan, "Guinness is good for you," hung on posters throughout Britain. Ads showed healthy, rosy-cheeked children, strong workers, smiling nurses, all thanks to Guinness's healing power. What's the reality? Iron content in a pint of Guinness is about 0.3 milligrams. For comparison, daily iron requirement for a pregnant woman is about 27 milligrams. To obtain this norm from Guinness, you'd need to drink approximately 90 pints, that's dozens of litres, per day. Iron content in Guinness is negligible and has no practical significance. But alcohol's harm to developing fetus is enormous and irrefutable. Alcohol freely crosses the placental barrier. It disrupts fetal brain development, leads to developmental defects, causes fetal alcohol syndrome, a complex of irreversible physical and mental disorders. Today, medicine knows no safe dose of alcohol during pregnancy. This was mass delusion, committed from ignorance and commercial interest, covered by doctors' authority and beautiful advertising. At the same time, beer's medical role in antiquity can't be completely dismissed. As we recall, the Egyptian Ebers papyrus comprises hundreds of pages of medical prescriptions from approximately 1550 BCE, and beer regularly appears there as mixture base, and there was certain logic in this that modern science can explain. Alcohol is an effective solvent for many organic compounds. It helped extract active substances from medicinal herbs more effectively than simple water. Sugars contained in beer made bitter herbal infusions more palatable. Egyptian doctors added various ingredients to beer depending on ailment: dates and honey for sweetness and calories, celery for digestive problems, lupine as diuretic, and for serious cases requiring anesthesia before heavy procedures, plants with strong sedative effect were used. Mandrake, one of ancient medicine's plants with powerful sedative action. Similar agents could be used to dull pain and fear before heavy procedures, but the margin for error was narrow. Overdose is dangerous. The patient drank a large portion of such drink and fell into deep sleep. In this state, doctors could conduct painful manipulations. Of course, this was risky. Mandrake in high doses is lethally poisonous. But in an era when there was neither ether nor chloroform, this was one of few available means. So beer's medical role in antiquity was genuine. Problems began later, when people forgot caution and began considering alcohol a panacea for all ills, not understanding its dangers. And so, having passed through at least 13,000 years of history, through civilization's rise and fall, through wars and revolutions, through prohibition and revivals, we approach a philosophical question. What is beer really? Just a drink, or something more? Conclusion. Through the foam of time, humanity's mirror. Beer's history isn't one drink's history. It's humanity's history told through one of our oldest inventions, prism. If you look carefully at these 13 millennia, it becomes clear. Beer was never just beer. It was civilization's catalyst. There's compelling evidence that fermented grain drinks were part of ritual feasts in places like Göbekli Tepe. Giant stone vats filled with beverage possibly united people from distant tribes for joint labour that seemed impossible. Beer gave us agriculture, permanent settlements, division of labour, all foundations of what we call civilization. It was one of the first forms of labour payment. Long before coin invention, before gold and silver appeared as exchange mediums, beer was part of daily rations in Sumer and Egypt. Pyramid builders received daily beer allowances. This was their wages, their motivation, their energy. Without this system, those giant projects that still inspire wonder would have been impossible. It was part of religion, the god's sacred gift. Sumerian Ninkasi, Egyptian Tenenet, St. Brigid of Ireland, chicha as offering to Pachamama. In all cultures, beer connected the human world with the divine. According to Egyptian legend, humanity owes its very existence to enormous amounts of beer that put bloodthirsty Sekhmet to sleep. It was science's engine. The desire to understand and control fermentation made Louis Pasteur peer into a microscope and discover the world of microorganisms, a discovery that transformed all medicine and saved millions of lives. Emil Hansen, working on beer stability problems, isolated pure yeast cultures and laid foundations for modern biotechnology. Carl von Linde, creating a refrigerator for a brewery, gave the world technology without which modern civilization is unthinkable. It was a symbol of rebellion and freedom. Medieval women brewers around whom suspicions and demonizing images arose. Urban brewers who used hops instead of Grape to break free from church and feudal lords' tax stranglehold. 4 friends who rebelled against uniformity and standardization. Late 20th century craft brewers who refused to accept a world where all beer tastes like water. In every era, beer became a banner for those who didn't want to submit, and it was always a mirror reflecting society's state. By how beer was brewed and consumed in any given era, you can judge technology level, social structure, people's values and fears. In Sumer, beer was consumed through straws from a common vessel. Perhaps this was a society where collectivism and mutual trust were vital for survival. In medieval Europe, beer was drunk by everyone, from infants to elderly, because urban water was often dangerous. This was a society balanced on epidemic's brink. In Victorian England, strong porter was consumed by dockers and porters. This was Industrial Revolution society, where heavy physical labour demanded caloric sustenance. In 1920s America, beer was banned. This was a society torn between puritanical values of the past and present freedoms. In the 50s-70s of the 20th century, beer became characterless and uniform, like mass consumption society itself, where individuality was sacrificed to production efficiency. And in our time, craft beer revival reflects striving for authenticity, local character, diversity, reaction to globalization, and standardization. From Neolithic stone vessels to orbital stations, at least 13,000 years beer has accompanied us. It nourished builders of world wonders. It inspired scientists to discoveries. It comforted soldiers in trenches. It united strangers in moments of celebration. Today, the world produces about 200 billion litres of beer per year. Next time you raise a glass, remember, this isn't just an alcoholic beverage. This is 13,000 years of history compressed into a single moment. This is Sumerian scribes' labour recording the first recipe. This is Egyptian builders sweat-hauling stones under blazing sun. This is Hildegard of Bingen's genius, one of the first to describe hops as natural preservative. This is Trappist monks' persistence preserving traditions through centuries. This is Pasteur's discoveries under microscope. This is 4 friends whose idea born on an island trip resulted in camera. From Sumerian straw to craft bar in Berlin, Portland or Tokyo, beer remains what it always was. Liquid sustenance, social glue, a gift that connects us to our humanity, a mirror reflecting our hopes, our weaknesses, our triumphs and defeats. Somewhere in a quiet Belgian monastery, an elderly Trappist monk whose hands tremble with age carefully pours amber ale into an oak barrel, following a recipe written 800 years ago. He whispers a prayer. For him, this isn't work. It's sacred service. Through this barrel, he's connected to an infinite chain of brothers who brewed this beer before him, century after century. In a trendy Seattle neighborhood, a bearded brewer in an apron covered with hop and malt stains adds rare Ethiopian coffee and New Zealand hops with passion fruit aroma to his experimental IPA. He doesn't think about history. He just wants to create something new, surprise people, make them say, "Wow, I've never tasted anything like this. In a London craft bar, a young bartender with arm tattoos pours seasonal beer with blackberries and Yorkshire honey into glasses. Customers, programmers from the neighbouring office, students, random passers-by, taste, discuss, debate flavours. They're all links in one incredibly long chain stretched through 13 millennia and 6 continents. From Rakafet Cave to Göbekli Tepe, from Sumerian taverns to Egyptian pyramids, from Celtic settlements to Roman legions, from medieval monasteries to Victorian porters, from Prohibition to Revival, and somewhere beyond, in eternity, beyond time and space, Goddess Ninkasi smiles. She who fills mouths with abundance looks at her children scattered across the world and sees that the great work continues. Her gift to humanity endures. Beer is brewed. People gather together, drink, laugh, argue, reconcile, fall in love, dream. The journey continues.